Hey, Josh from Bildr here, and this video is going to go over the deep dive of what's actually going on behind the scenes in the Bildr chatbot template that we built with Xano. And in this video specifically, I'm going to go over like the flows step by step, what's occurring, how the actual pages work together to deliver the single page experience that you're seeing, and also a little bit about how the workflows are set up to integrate with OpenAI so you understand a little bit more about how to use a chatbot specifically in context of this application, but also in general. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple examples of how you can use OpenAI as you're maybe thinking about how to take this template, integrate it into your projects, or build a product on top of it. Some ways that you might be using those processes and OpenAI in particular. So I'll go step by step and just start from the top with us logged into logged into the new Bildr and Xano chatbot template that I just copied from the clone. And I just did this in the other video before where I just showed you how to set up the API calls in the right locations. And now I'm going to, again, step by step. The first thing I want to just go over on a little bit of a higher level, again, is talking through what's actually occurring, because as you can see here, it feels like we've got a lot of different pages going on here. And the reality is the way that Bildr is built is a very component-based design where you build sections of, you build full pages, but you can also build sections that you'll use inside of those pages over and over again. And so just for a couple examples here, this is the actual app homepage. This is what's tied to a URL specifically, our homepage URL with no / in this instance. And then if I go to these pages, you'll see this is the conversation page that actually opens up into this container, either for a new conversation or for opening an existing conversation. And then I use, for example, our prompts row. So this is what it looks like when I have a prompt on the screen. And I use this in two different pages, both our conversation page, as well as in our create and manage prompts page. And so you can see some usability where you use one page here in multiple parts of your application. And then you also see how you're going to use one parent page that will again tied to the URL, and you're going to open up multiple pages into a container, let's say like the conversation page or the manage prompts page right here. And so you'll see a little bit of this in action. I just want to show you as you step in why you're seeing it designed and laid out this way. So let's go into our homepage just for us to start. The first thing that happens by default every time you open a Bildr page is there's a flow called page load. And you can change this if you want to. Personally, I don't think I ever do. But page load triggers every time the page loads, whether that's loading on the URL or if you open a page into a container, that page load flow triggers at that moment. And so in this case, whenever we load up our homepage, we do a couple things. One, we do the set copy variable. This basically sets a variable that lets me run a Bildr no-code flow from a page header template that I have that helps me with displaying code blocks and adding a copy button inside of the replies from OpenAI. So it was a third-party library that I used to do that, and I actually wrote a little bit of code with ChatGPT. I wrote code. ChatGPT just gave me code. And then setting this variable was one part of that. Basically says this is a variable set to clarify which flow on this page, so newMessage copied code show. This is the flow I want to be associated with this variable. And then I refer to this variable in that header. I'll just show you briefly. So this is that header it's called the Prettify library. It basically makes code look like code blocks instead of just the normal text on the screen. So when I run a function from this, add prettyprint and trigger Prettify, I do it whenever I load up a message page. I trigger those two functions, and inside of this, we create a copy code button. And then I add, in this event listener, I actually create a local variable from this variable that I set on the main page. That is basically saying which flow I want you to run, and then I run that flow right here. And by doing it this way, setting it into a variable, I make it easy. It's basically allowing me to make it work for the templates that we have here. So that's not something you'll do very common. In fact, it's the first time I've ever done anything like this, just for this template case. But I just wanted to show you since it was the first flow that we saw. More importantly, the first thing that we do is we authorize the user when the page loads. Is this user that is here logged in and authorized? And so I run the standard Xano auth action. Yours is going to be your own URL here, but the rest of this will all look the exact same. The way we've set up our Xano actions is that we will automatically set a cookie for the auth token for you whenever you run the action, and we'll set it into a specific location. And so in this case, we set that cookie in the Xano login token. We actually have already set it in, and I'll show you in a second. We've already set it into this cookie name. And so if the token is there and valid, this runs to basically say, is this token still valid? And if it is, great. If it's not, then that's going to basically say what we should do. And so you'll see as we go to the bottom here, if this is on success and our token is valid, go ahead and run the open new conversation page load action. If not, run the show lightbox for new authentication. And when we say show lightbox for new authentication, it's showing up basically a pop-up into the screen that lets me show a message essentially. And I use that message center in a couple ways that I'll show you later on too. But what that show lightbox function actually does is create a little pop-up that actually, let me just show you. If we go over to our user authentication flow, this is the actual page that opens up into our show lightbox right here under this different workspace. And this page will alternate depending on what the user clicks between a user sign up with password or the user sign in with password pages. And it's on these two pages where we actually have the Xano actions for signing up. So it's simply the Xano sign up action. Again, if you've come from the video already where we showed the setup, you'll have already done this. It's just the sign up action for Xano. We pull the email and the password written into the page into these options and send it with the API call. We set the response into whatever we want. More importantly, for these two actions, we're basically saying, is it successful or does it fail? If it fails, we run a flow that will set the value of an error message on the screen from the response that the Xano reply gave it. For example, this user's already signed up, or invalid password. Whatever it is, the Xano response sends us that message, and we just take that message and display it to the user on the front end so that they know what to do. And then this flow is simply re-enabling the ability for them to attempt it again. Now, if it does work, we go ahead and do this flow, which runs another flow on our home page of the app. And this is you'll see in a few instances as I walk through the template, this happen. Run flow on page is a very common thing because we have a structure where you've got these component-based designs. Oftentimes you will be referring to no-code flows of actions on different pages to make sure that you're giving the experience that you want. And so basically what I'm saying here is, okay, I have a successful new user that logged in. I want to run my new signup flow. And that's on my home page of the application that I'll walk to in a second. And in this one, we hide the lightbox, so we disappear the message on the screen, and then we'll do a couple things there. Generally, the sign in with password works the exact same way. The only real functional difference is that here we go. Instead of the sign up, we have the login function, and it does the exact same thing, same failure code process. The only difference is we have an existing user logged in flow and a new user logged in flow that runs differently. And so these two things will pop up whenever we need to. And so I'm on this page right now, I hit refresh, and I'm not authenticated. And so you saw for a split moment this loaded up, and then it saw, okay, this person isn't authenticated. Go ahead and run and show this. And if you want to actually see that, one thing that I always find helpful as I'm learning is understanding what's actually happening. And it's something that we haven't done a lot of in our education. What we can definitely do a better job of is showing you what we mean. So again, we said when the page loads, we do that Xano auth me action from the home page that says, is the token that's here authenticated? Yes or no? If it's no, pop this up. And so it happens really quickly, but what's actually happening, if we go to our network, if I reload this page, you'll see a series of things that happen. Network means if there's something that's data driven, like sending or receiving data, it's going to pop up in your network as it happens. You have to have your network open or else the history won't log here. But you'll see what ran is this me is an actually our Xano action to go test out the token that we have. And so that's what's running here. And we got a 401. So that's the failure. And so what's happening is our builder page has page load. It's actually Xano auth. So this is what was just run. That's the me. This /me is what was run. We tried this token out. It said, nope, not good, 401. If it worked, it'd be a 200. And so by 401, we automatically see this invalidation here, and then we show the light box for no authentication. And that's why when we load up the page, you see it pop up. So now let me go ahead and sign up. I think I've already signed up actually with this. So I'll do with a new one. And so I'm going to clear this just so you can see it happen. So I hit login. I do have some examples here. You can tell I was playing around with some of the custom prompts that we have in here that I'll talk about later. But you'll see I ran this login function. I sent this request that was login, and it came back valid and sent me an auth token back. And so what our builder action does on that login action, so that was login, same exact thing really with a sign up or a login. There's not a lot of difference, but it is a different API endpoint. What the builder action does, it says, okay, set the response into this variable. So we have responses in an API call are the actual content that gets sent back. So if you, typically an API response is broken up into two key parts. First is like the status. Sometimes the status also has a message associated with it, but then also the response. The status code is usually just a code like 400 or 200. Usually 200 is good. Anything else means it didn't work correctly. And usually that means the message and response that you get is some sort of error message that you can use to debug what went wrong. But in these actions, we ask you to clarify the location of the token that you want us to put. So if we look over here, this is the auth token that we got back whenever I logged in. And so this is the actual token that we've stored inside of this location Xano login token on the browser. And we set it to expire in 30 days. So in 30 days, it'll be gone. They would have to revalidate. You can certainly, depending on your security needs, you could have a 1 day or a 60-minute session if you really wanted to. It would be up to you. And then we do run this client side or server side. Client side basically means it runs on the browser exclusively between the browser, and then it goes to the Xano call and then sends it back to the browser. If you run something server side, it goes through Bildr's server first, and then we send out the call. In Xano's case, for many, if not all the actions we're using here, we're using client side because one, it takes out the need for the API call through the Bildr server. So it does that. But two, the main reason is it doesn't have any need to have a security token inside of the API call. A security token is something, or an API token needs to be a secret, and in the sense that you don't want your end users to see that code or else they could use your API. You'll see this with the OpenAI code. We have an API secret that no one should ever see. And so, for example, in the follow-up to this, when I show you how to set this up with just Bildr specific data collections and Bildr's OpenAI direct actions, we use that secret. And so we need to make sure that those API calls run on the server side because they need to use that secret. And if we try to do that on the client side, that would incorrectly expose the secret to the client on their browser. And that's just creates insecurities in your design. And so that's why we have this drop down of choosing client side or server side. Typically, if you have something that's a secret, like that you'll know, typically when you're building an API call, you would do server side. And we won't send the secret to the client side anyways. So if you try to do client side and you're using a secret inside of the code, it just won't work. So that would be why. And again, with Xano, the way we've set this up, for the most part, we don't need any secrets. So we're running them client side, a little bit faster and a little bit more efficient for your project. So let's jump back over to our home page now. So again, we showed you, this is the auth token that pops right into us. And so I did the login, existing user logged in here. This is the flow on this page that successful login told me to run. And so you can see the first thing I do is I open a new conversation. Open a new conversation simply says, okay, we want to open this page up into this page. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second on how this page knows how to behave whenever it gets opened up. Then we hide the lightbox. That is actually what's just disappearing the message box that we saw on the screen. So the reason that overlay of that form is gone is because of that hide lightbox action. And then we do this flow at the end of this for get Xano info on user. And so this is another API call that we send to Xano. You actually can see it right here. And if we go to our Xano side, now we're getting into some of the little more custom actions, and I wanted to show you that. If we go to the Xano side, we have our user multi-call right here. The user multi-call has been set up where it is simply a request where you send it to the API call to this endpoint, and you include the auth token. Xano already knows what user that auth token is associated with. So what it does is it goes and looks up information for that user based off that auth token. And what we're asking with the multi-call, we're combining a few different collections into one request. And in our case, we're getting that user's conversation history, so the names of the conversations that they're associated with, as well as all of the prompts that they are also associated with. So all of that information comes back to us in a JSON array like this. And this is what it looks like in the browser. You won't always have to look at it this way, but we've got all of our conversations, and you see there's 5 results here that are popping up back to us. And so if you can see, like conversation 0 was this one. It doesn't have a name, conversation name, there you go. Discuss the importance of this. So that's what's showing up right here. Discuss the importance of this. And then we have system prompt. That was the original message that we sent to it to give them basically directions on how to behave. We'll show you that in a little bit. But this is just simply returning a list of all the conversations and their names, and you can see one by one as they go down here what they are. We are also returning the prompts of the user, and the prompts of the user is specifically the prompts that they have created. Let's look at prompt title. This is new. Right there. So it actually looks like we are only returning one prompt. So that might be an error in the design where this call in particular is only returning what looks like the most recent custom prompt added, and it should be allowing me to return multiple. We're actually not using this source of prompts at all in this, but that's why we're seeing this there's only one value. So realistically, like if I was trying to use this value, I would really need to get more because these are all the ones that are actually there. It should show up more like our conversations with 0 for the first one, 1 for the next one, but it's only showing 1, which is telling me it's really not getting multiple, which is okay. Again, we're not using it. We actually do a separate call here for all of our prompts, as well as on our manage prompts page. So we'll take care of that later. So again, what's happening is when we run this call, that was the call we just walked through, we use the Xano login token that we had just put into the page to do the call. That call sends us back something that we label all of that data into a variable called the Xano complete response. So this entire array of information, this is just an array of data. If we like wrote this out and not in this format, it would literally just be text of like squiggly bracket or hard bracket, here's information, squiggly bracket, auth 0 auth, squiggly bracket, this information, and it just goes down the line right here. And so we just set that whole response into the Xano complete response. We check the status code, and if it is successful, we go ahead and run page binding. If not, we run force refresh. This is an important concept where basically all of our authenticated actions require a successful and valid Xano login token. If that is not a valid token, it'll tell us with a 400 error, maybe 401, and we do a force refresh, which reloads the page, meaning everything's gone. And it basically if a user is unauthenticated, now we will recheck and auth them at the page load function, and we'll reshow, hey, you have to log in again if there's an error. So you'll see this on every single API call that is required for a logged in user, which is basically all of them except the login and sign up actions. So let's assume it works. We go ahead and run what we call page bindings. Now, page bindings is something that you're going to use a lot inside of your Bildr projects, especially if you're using Bildr data, and even if you're using external data like this. It's a really great way to basically say anything that you've identified in the studio that is an element that you want to be informed of and display specific data, go do that now. And in many cases, like you could have, let's say you had a Facebook profile, you might have 50, 100 different things on that page because it's like a profile that is data bound to a specific value from the record that is set into the page. And so this just takes care of all of them. So instead of having to one by one have this complex flow, instead, if we click on an element, and in this case, this is the only one that we're doing it for. If you click on an element, if we click over to data right here, we have from, value, or variable. And so I could do from a field, which would pull from a Bildr data collection. In the future, we'll make it so this could pull from any data collection. But right now, I'm doing it from variable. And if you recall, that user multi-call, I set the entire response into Xano complete response. And I did dot conversations with of user. And so what that means is, like, we know all of my information is here, and then normal dot notation basically says, go get this next value going down the line there. So if you recall over here, we know this is our response, and we have conversations of users here has all of this data. Great. So we know dot underscore conversations of user is just going to give me all of that data that shows underneath it. And what the repeating list does, it takes what this is called, this is a JSON array of data, and or JSON array of objects, actually, I think it's the technical term, which means, again, it's like hard bracket, squiggly bracket, and then in each squiggly bracket is all the information for one JSON object. And then we go to the next one, it's comma, the next JSON object opens up, and it is the next one. And that's how these are all designed right here. And so the repeating list element in Bildr automatically unravels any sort of JSON that you set into it, and makes one page for each object in it. So every single row that we have here becomes one page that opens up. And that page that we've identified is this conversation's name row right here. So this setup basically says, for every individual record of data, I want you to create one of these page instances, and I want you to put it right here on the page. And the data that I'm going to use to determine how many to create is going to be located here, which is our Xano complete response dot underscore conversations of user. Now, one thing I want to show you is, and I can show you this because it won't change anything all that much, is our Xano API call can also, because we're not using any other data, rather, we don't need to use this variable later on, we're just using it when we set the data in. We also have the ability to directly set custom paths as well. And so similar to how I had that Xano complete response dot something specific, I can actually just do something like that directly inside of this individual action instead of data binding if I wanted to. And in some instances, you might not want to run data binding for the whole page, but you want to just set a certain response into a certain area. And so in that case, I could do set custom paths, and you have two options to set custom paths into variables or into elements on the current page as well. And so I know underscore conversations of user is again the same location how I had dot inside of that variable. This is going to do the same thing where it looks for this path inside of the variable, and then I can choose to just set it immediately into my repeating list for conversation history. And because of this, I actually wouldn't even have to run page binding, because the page binding is what then took the variable before and then set it into this. And if I just don't run it, it won't matter, because this action now will entirely take care of that for me so I don't have to worry about it. So let me show you, let's just refresh and show you that it's going to work the exact same way. And we just took away the page binding on success. So we're basically not running anything on success. The only thing we would do now, if this call failed, would be to force a refresh. And so if I log in now, we should see what feels like the exact same experience, but it wasn't set via the page binding in the studio. It was set via this action. So those are two different ways that you can get data from an API call into your Bildr Studio to display or to use in a variable later on. And you can do it, again, based off of what you need to in that individual circumstance, directly in the API call itself or via page bindings. It really will depend. Now I'll jump into an example where you actually will, typically it'll be much easier to do this with page bindings. And that's actually these rows that are appearing in this repeating list element. So let's go over to our conversation name row. Again, the page that opens up once for each row that we have. And you'll see in this page specifically, I actually have one instance of data binding. And later on, I'll show you areas where we have more in other situations. So I have my conversation name right here. And that conversation name is the same way that we data bound the whole repeating list element on the parent page. I'm binding it to the variable name conversation underscore capital name. This capitals always matter, FYI, if you don't know that. So if I did lowercase, it wouldn't work correctly. And so the other important thing to know about the repeating list, whether you're using Bildr data or any data source, any JSON, you could custom write JSON if you wanted to and just set it into it. And it would do the exact same thing. Whenever it creates a page for each object, for one of each item inside of that array of items, think of it just like a database. If you're not super familiar with JSON, it's just a database and there's one row for every single item and we're just creating a page for each one. And this variable name will show up because when we do this call, let me go back to my user multi-call here. When we do this call, we have this top level variable that is all of the arrays of data. And when we open up and look at the values inside one of those arrays, you'll see all of these values right here. And this is a great way. I'm showing you this in network in the preview here, because anytime if you're debugging API calls, you're a little curious what's going on, finding this information in network and seeing what's actually occurring here and translating it into Bildr is going to help your building process immensely. And so let's just choose, we're going to choose the conversation no code UX mentor, right? So this is this row right here. All of these variables exist on the page as soon as it gets created. The repeating list creates that variable for that page instantaneously when it gets created. And so I always want my conversation name to be tied to this specific value associated with it right here. And so that's what I've done. I've simply said, okay, conversation name is going to come in and I want to display this value. And so by data binding it from the variable conversation name, I'm going to get that to show up in the list. Now, a couple other important things to know here is we've got a little bit of extra information here that's coming in. We have our OpenAI ID. We have a system prompt. This is our original system prompt that we gave it. I would probably design this a little bit differently. Depending on depending on my use case, I would design the API call differently itself, like what data is returned here. But you also have last chat, so you could also organize these. I don't know why it's null, so that would be something on the Xano side about why this is coming in null. But knowing that, like I could have a little timestamp of, hey, like this was done at the last, like whatever. Or I do have a created at timestamp. So this string right here is called a Unix timestamp. And basically, it's a globalized way to have just a string of characters represent a specific moment in time down to a millisecond. And so they starts in like 1970. If you look at Unix timestamp, we don't have to get too deep now. But from this, I could display created on like last Tuesday at 3:42 p.m. And I could do logic and use the created at variable to display that on the page. Now, I'm going over this because this is one important principle that we will be using throughout our application, because an ID is a unique thing for every single element, or rather every data point that you have will have an ID associated with it. And we use that ID to deliver the context inside of the application that is needed to basically say, this is the specific one that I want to get right now. And the first example is when I open up a conversation and I want to find that conversation's history, the ID is the most important specific item that we need to make sure that happens, because it also clarifies the difference of opening a new conversation where I'm going to show the prompts, or opening up an existing conversation where I'm actually going to show the existing conversation's messages and go get them. So let's show that process now. So I'm on my conversations name row page here. I click on it, and you can see I've got on the left-hand side, anytime you see this line right here, you got a little arrow and then a thing happening. That means that there's an event associated with that specific object. This is our parent div. Basically, this entire row that gets highlighted has a specific event associated with it on click to open up a conversation. So anytime you need like a click event, or if you want something to happen whenever you mouse over something, not CSS only, like that's a CSS property for under styling, which we can show an example of. But if you want something to happen, if I hover over this, maybe it's like an analytics event and you want to know if someone hovers over something, you could record an event when the mouse entered that area. So I do my open conversation event whenever they click on this, which is what my user probably expects. I do a few things. I won't get into all the CSX actions, but the way that you're seeing this green pop up whenever I've selected it is when I select it, I add a style class that is the conversation row selected. It basically just makes the background permanently green instead of only when I hover over it. And you will see that I do also run this page first, which is deselecting the previous page that was selected. So when I select a page, I do two things really. I add a variable to that page specifically called selected yes, and then I add the style class for the div to become green. Now, when I select any other page, what I want to happen first before that occurs is I want to go run the deselect flow and remove the variable and remove the selected background styling. And I need to target, it's going to be the same page here, so it's a conversation name row page, but I need to target the page that currently has selected equals yes on. So I run that first, which goes and removes it from whatever page that was on. And then I add the styling immediately after to this page specifically. And so that's a way for me to create that experience of selecting it and then deselecting the other ones all within the same flow. This is just a flow that we run if we're on mobile. If I select a menu, I want to automatically hide the mobile menu. I'll show you guys a demo of that at the end because this is a full PWA that we'll get to right at the end of this actually for sure. And as a PWA, it can be installable to your phone. And we already have the prompts pre-done for you guys, so you won't have to worry about seeing any of this or knowing how to do any of this. Is all going to be done for you, and you can manage and change it if you need to. So this is just another flow that I run to close the menu. If it was opened, it would now close the mobile menu and make sure that it gives like the normal selecting like experience in that case. And so the next thing I do, so just this little garbage can here, you can see I'm showing it if it's selected. That's what's being shown there. So that's like a little div that's hidden right there. And it's hidden normally unless it's selected, and then I go ahead and show it. And then finally, getting back to the data movement, I run the flow that opens up our conversation page. Let me zoom out just a little bit. Quick tip, Shift minus and Shift plus will zoom in or out on the canvas. If you're selected to a page, it'll center that page that's selected into the screen. If I am not selected, it'll use the very middle of that canvas to let you refocus on it. Little tweaks about navigating definitely help you move a little faster throughout the studio. So I am opening up this page into that container on my home page, but the important thing is I do this custom data mapping. And all I'm doing in this context is I'm sending a specific variable or set of variables to the page I'm opening it up into. I do this later on with this page and I'll show you it later. So in this case, I'm saying when you open this page, I want you to create the variables that I list out here in a JSON array. And basically I'm saying ID in this code construct, I'm saying ID equals ID of this page from the variable. Go ahead and put that on the page. And so this code, when used in context of this action, is just a JSON array that creates the page with variables for everything I've clarified here. And again, by using from variable ID from this page, if we recall, when this page was created, this variable got set on it. And so even though I'm not displaying it, the variable exists there for me to use how I need to. And so ID exists here. I click ID and I'm opening up our new conversations page right here. And so I'll get to this page in just a moment then, but I just wanted to show the other way that we are opening up pages is with open new conversation, which we do automatically trigger this action when the page, when they log in. So basically whether it's an existing user logged in or a new signup. So it's new signup confirm flow. You'll see we do the open new conversation right here for each of those flows, which opens up this page into this page right here. So there's like a few different ways in which we just open up this page here. Now, again, this page has to know how to behave whenever it loads up. And so the first thing that we do on page load of this page is an if-then check. Again, page load runs whenever this page shows up, not just page load of the URL, but page load of this page first appearing inside of our browser or when it is refreshed, open a new conversation. And the first thing we're doing is check on the current page for the variable called ID. So whatever the value is in this variable ID, do this logic. So if it's empty, I know that I didn't create this page from a click here. I know I created it from a new conversation click or some sort of other flow saying open a new conversation. And so that tells this page how I need you to behave, because the next action will vary depending on what that is. If it's a brand new conversation, I want to go get all of the user prompts to show on the page. So if I hit new conversation, I have all of our user prompts here. And if we go all the way to the bottom, you'll see our user prompts API action was just run, and I have a list of all our user prompts that just came back in. And these are being set into these pages right here. So that was the first one when it's a brand new conversation, and that's all we need to do. We just need to get the prompts, and then I do hide the div that contains our messages, and I show this div right here. Little bit excessive technically, because this is actually going to be empty anyway, since we're not setting any values into it, but I use this hide and show to do that anyways. The other route, if we were opening up a conversation so the ID is known, we go and run an API call right here to go get that conversation's information. So let me show you in the Xano side. We just talked about, we have this user prompts function. This is the API call we ran to get the prompts. And all this does, again, it looks at the auth ID. So this is our auth token that was sent. Bildr sends automatically from that cookie. It looks at, is the owner, it looks at this ID and says, give me the prompts that are associated for the creator of this prompt, if it's that person that's logged in. So that's their own custom prompts. Or send me also the prompts where the global prompt attribute is equal to true. And then it sends me this value right here, which is just, again, a JSON array of data. That's what I'm seeing right here. This is the exact structure that it's sent. And this action at that point, or rather, let me just go back to page load brand new conversation to show you the user prompts. And so in this case, again, this is an example where we're not using the page binding process of putting the data in. We're just going to directly set the entirety of the response, because it's just, the response is only the JSON array of data that we need. We just set it directly into our repeating list elements for prompts right here. And so our other side is a get new conversation or get conversation history. And so this API call is looking for, it's a get, so there's no body in it. If we had a post, there would be a body section that shows up here. So typically when you have a get call and you have to send values, you're going to put them inside of the URL parameters itself. I send this call, conversations, conversation _ ID equals. The question mark introduces all the variables that we want, and then I list the variable, and then I do equal. And then that lets me send in a variable to add to this equation. And in this case, I'm going to pull from that ID that I set into the page from this message. And I'm going to pull from that ID and go get all of the conversations associated with that, or all of the messages rather, associated with this ID and that conversation. So that's what's occurring here. So let me show you. I'm going to clear out our network here. So that's gone. But now if I open up a current conversation, you can see the conversations popped up. And we have our API endpoint conversations, conversation _ ID equals 5. So it's the ID number 5 conversation here. And I can see the response includes our 2 messages. And then directly in that API call, I set those messages into the page right here. And so in this case, I am just setting it directly into the repeating list messages as well. And after this, on success, I run page binding, which is in this case, based off of how I reuse that get messages flow. In page binding is where I do a couple things that are necessary for other flows really, but I also do the hide and show, where in this case, I hide our prompts div and I show our conversations div. So that's on the page load of this conversations page, and gives you a good idea of what it's like to just get the experience to the point that we're opening up the conversation. Now, the next thing that happens though is if this conversation is new, or if we're going to send a new message, I need to be able to do that. And so we have 2 ways that we can start a conversation. First, we have, can we just type in to begin a thread? And then we also have, if I click a prompt, so if I go over here, we can see, I'll click new conversation, and we can see if I click any of these prompts, I can start a new conversation, or I can start a new conversation here. And you can see that started off and that began a conversation. And so I need to make sure that I'm able to handle the different scenarios in which we start a conversation so that the rest of the page can operate the right way. Let's start with our text input right here for sending a new message that we have. So I've got our new message, and on the new message event, there's really one key event that triggers. There's another one that lets us automatically react to the scroll height, creating the growing effect on a message. So if I send a message that's really long, it will automatically grow for me up to a certain amount. And so I take care of that automatically with the key up event. I set the height to scroll height, which basically starts with set the height to auto, which gives me an accurate perception of what the scroll height is. And then I just update immediately after that, I update the height to be the actual scroll height from the variable here. And then I have to add pixel at the end because scroll height will always just output a number without a pixel. And so by then setting the height of the text element that I have selected here, by setting the height to scroll height with pixel at the end, I then reset it. And then it does max out specifically because under styling on this element, I have a max height set right here of 192. So even if I were to manually set the height to, let's say, the scroll height is 255 pixels, it wouldn't matter because although the height attribute has been set, the 192 would prevent it from growing any further. And so that creates a reasonable amount of growth in the text area without having to worry about it overtaking the entire screen. So getting back to starting a new conversation from this element, we have our enter new message, check if ID is known action that we run. So whenever we hit enter on this, Or if we click our send button right here, we run that flow, new message, check if ID is known. And so just like when we load up the page to check to see if the variable ID is known, I do the same thing whenever I click enter or send a new message. I'm checking to see if the ID is known. And there's a series of events I do right before that. This is where I actually check to see, check if ID is known. So I check here, and then that tells me, okay, start new conversation or create message to continue conversation. And I'll get to that in a second. I want to quickly walk through these actions above it. So first, I set a variable from the value of the new message. So basically what the person has typed in, I turn that into a variable called new message. And this variable, again, is set from the value. I do have these series of what are called paths, P-A-T-H-S. So these paths basically make sure that I'm escaping out some values that cause issues in API calls. So sometimes having a question mark or double quotes can cause an issue. Things like that can prevent challenges to where just all of a sudden JavaScript breaks unless you handle it appropriately. That's why a lot of times we have like different codes to indicate this was quotes. It's actually like ampersand, QUO, and then like a semicolon that represents quote. So eventually we move it back to a quote whenever we need to display it, but the code treats it as something differently. And we do this to prevent any JavaScript breaks coming from that. Now, I will say, by the time that you are in this project, one, this may be gone entirely, or two, we are fixing, I shouldn't say fixing, we are updating our process so that if you pull a value from a text element, we're gonna automatically do a lot of this for you. So you're never gonna have to see it. But if you ever do have this random situation in which on any platform, if you're pulling value from an element and it just seems to be breaking at random occurrences, there's a good chance there's either hidden or certain types of characters in that element causing it to break. And so this is a way around it that I'm doing it right here. So I set that element. I then disable the text input as well as this button. And so disable elements remove the ability for someone to click it. So what I'm doing here is set the variable. I disable those two actions. Basically, by disabling the picture and this element, it can no longer be clicked. So I just guarantee that only one thing is happening at a time. And then there's two things I do here. I do the showing animation. If you recall, when I sent a new message, this little animation pops up. Basically a little load icon. You could do all sorts of things that you would prefer doing there. But you can see it shows up and then it goes away once this actually completes. And so this is my action showing the animation, so I show it. I also take care of some extra potential scenarios where, like we said, with a brand new message, I want to make sure that I'm hiding my prompts if they were there before, and I'm showing my message area. So those are also included here as well. And then the final thing is I set the repeating list element with the value in the repeating list element plus the new message that is going into it. This is important because the experience I want to give someone as a user, hey, I just sent this, is I want them to feel like as soon as I hit enter, it pops up into the conversation. The reality is what is actually occurring when we do this is I send the message through the API call, which I'll show in a moment here, and then after I get the response back, I then do a new call to go get the conversation history. So I reuse that same action that, remember, on the page load of this, we had the get conversation history. I then reuse this action to reset the data into the page, which eventually will happen, but I don't want to wait for this like message experience for that to occur, because especially for longer messages, that might take a long time. And so instead, I run that action that I was just on inside the show animation flow, where I take the value that's currently in the repeating list, and then I add to it a new array of data with the new message, with the information that this is from the user. I add a new message to the process to make sure that the repeating list can display this new message at the bottom of it by including it right here. If I put this for some reason at the top, it would have appeared at the very top of the list. This makes sure it goes directly to the bottom in this order. And so that's what this set value element is doing. It's basically creating my own object and my own array and my own object so that I can add it to an existing repeating list already on the page. And so now we can go back to our new message here. This just removes the message. So I just set the element to empty. So it erases the content that was there before. And then I resize it back to its original height and its original intended display height so that it looks like it's a brand new message again. And so finally, that brings me to my if-then logic to see if there's an ID on the page yet. Again, remember, when we click new conversation, there's no ID that gets passed in. But when we click an existing conversation, an ID was passed in so that I could open with its content. And by doing it this way, I am doing the same exact check here every time I send a message here. And so if it's empty, I'm going to start a new conversation. And the reason that we have two different calls here is because an API call to have a conversation with ChatGPT is a history of every single message that's been given to it inside of that thread. And so ChatGPT doesn't have a memory of, okay, this is the thing that we were just talking about. It's just a computer that takes a call, goes and processes something and puts a response back. And so every single time that you send something to ChatGPT, you actually need to make sure it has all of that history. And so we've designed in this case on the Xano side, two different API calls that we use. One is for continuing a conversation and one is for starting a new conversation. In our start a new conversation, we're really looking for three inputs. We look for a system prompt, a name for the conversation, and a message. A system prompt is a system message that we send to ChatGPT, the OpenAI request, to basically say, here's the context of who you are. Like, here's the role that you're playing in this conversation. And we'll use system prompts later. I'll talk about those in a moment for a continued conversation. But it's basically extra information for the AI to work and behave the way that we want it to instead of just responding to the message that we send. So we have this system prompt. We have a name for the conversation. That's the name that we eventually show right here. And then we have the message, and it's the message that we're sending to start that conversation. So these two are pretty straightforward. This one feels a little bit different, but I can show you that the way that we actually treat it in our automated case by default here, our system prompt value is you are a helpful assistant. I believe this is the same thing that ChatGPT uses. It's probably the most common thing that you see. But if you were wanting to create a situation where you were saying, hey, like you're a helpful car mechanic with 50 years of experience, the AI essentially is knowing, okay, I'm playing a more unique role here, so it might respond and communicate and research in a way that is skewed to the specific prompt that you gave it. And so that's just one example where a system prompt is giving it its role. Later on, you can also use system messages in a different way so that the AI always has the complete context that you want it to have and how it's responding, but maybe it's not a part of the actual back and forth chat. And so I'll talk about that again in a second on our continued conversation. So we've got in this thread here, though, we are starting a new conversation. We grab the system prompt that we have just manually typed in here. You could create your own interface if you wanted to have like a drop-down select, oh, I want to choose my own system prompts. You could do that too. Or you could just type in your own here. We've got a name. For the name, I actually just pull the first 15 characters out of this variable. So it's just a shorter version of the first conversation. You could also have a text field for them to type in a name for it. Or in the future, you could even build a Xano API call that could change and name the conversations themselves. That'd be really easy. It would just be a custom endpoint there. And then we've got the message, which again is just pulled from the new message variable that we set the first thing after we click enter on this page right here. So fairly straightforward there. And the biggest thing is, what is the response that we're getting whenever this call is completed? In this case, what we've done is we are taking the response and we're setting that response via custom paths to say, I want to put the part of the response that is the new conversation ID, I want to set it into a variable ID on this page. Now, this is a really important thing because the critical component that we are doing when we use this page, we are always checking to see if the ID is known. And so until this point, if it was a new conversation, the variable ID on this page was empty. But by doing this start new conversation API call, we are setting part of the response, which includes the ID, into the variable ID. So now that we have it, if we were to send a follow-up message, if you recall, the check that we did right before this step was check to see if the ID is known. Now the ID is known, which would drive us to this result instead. So I'm going to show the rest of this. So we set the custom path into ID. We are not doing anything else with it. And eventually we are just doing our new conversation created refresh conversations menu flow. So one thing that we do in this flow is once we've confirmed that the new conversation is successful, we refresh our conversations on the left-hand side. So this goes back to our main page and runs an API call to go get our new conversations. And so what that looks like, let me show a few things actually of what we're doing here. So let's go, I'm gonna open up my messages or my network tab again. I like showing this information as it happens. Let's start a new thread. We got our user prompts as we expected. Hey, I want to start a brand new conversation. And let's just hit enter. So let's look at what happened. So user prompts were already there, but one of the first things that happened was start conversation. So this indicates the start of it, and then ultimately start conversation. This is what the response is. So you'll see everything twice. Typically it's the second reply, I believe, that will always have the actual information. So if we recall, we have three things going on here. In our API call, let's go back to that. In our API call for a new conversation, we send to this URL the appropriate information. So the Xano login token is automatically added. This content type application JSON is automatically added. And we're sending these three values. So if we go over to our value here, it looks like that name actually should be shorter. So substring is not working for some reason. However, we see what we want here. We see, hey, I want to start a brand new conversation. That's the message. Name should be shorter. I don't know why it's not, but we'll look at that later. And then we've got our system prompt right here. So we're sending that over to Xano in this case. Those are the inputs that we wanted. What happens at this point, Xano immediately will do an API request to OpenAI. So it uses the information that we just gave it. So you can see in the inputs of this, we input our system prompt as a system message. So that's what this is here, because we have our array of messages. That's what this is. So this outside, these big hard blocks here means it's an array. This is an object inside of this array with these little squigglies. And these are the variable values inside of this object. So we have role system. That's telling it this is a system message. Role is either one of three things with OpenAI: system, assistant, or user. The replies back from the AI are assistant. The replies to it are user. So this is our system prompt that leads everything. And then we also send a user message. That's our actual message that we wrote to it. So all that comes in right here in the OpenAI response. From there, Xano's doing a few things just on the back end. It is creating a record for the new conversation, and then it's creating the messages inside of that conversation, representing the system message, representing the user message, and then representing the response message from the AI. So it does all of this after it gets its own response back from the API call that it runs on the server. And then it returns its response back to us. And so if we look again, this is the information that we sent. And then on our response, we can see status 200 means it was successful. And we see our new conversation ID. And so that new conversation ID, again, if we recall, I set into the variable ID. So now it's available for us to use in Bildr variables here later on, which takes us to our success call. So we do know, like we said, we redo the user multi-call on this page to refresh the conversation. That's why this conversation is now showing up here right away. And that's this is the reply, or rather, sorry, user multi-call. There it is. User multi-call is the reply that refreshes all of this information. And then the immediately thing after we start the conversation and Xano says, hey, 200, it came back in, here's the ID of that conversation. We then go redo, just like we did on page load, the exact same action. We go do our get for that conversation with the ID, but now we actually have an ID to pass. So it can go get the information that we want for this conversation. So we just send in the query string parameters, we send conversation ID 7. So if we go back to Xano real quick, we can see conversation. Here we go. Looking for conversation ID here. We just sent it right here in the payload. And then in the response, we get all of the messages back that we get. And so these messages are loading into the page right here and right here, allowing us to display them appropriately. And I'll show messages after I talk about continuing the conversation, but you can see that we have role coming in with this. Or if we recall, there's now a variable on each of these messages pages with the content as well as the role of that message, which we use to inform, and I'll show you this later on page load, how to display this information. And we also have the ID of that message as well as the conversation ID. So we can use those things later on, like if we want to delete a message, we were able to delete that message because of the fact that we had the ID of the conversation, and now it's gone. So we should have deleted it. Let's just double check. Yep. So now if we refresh that page again, you can see it's gone, and it's because we deleted it with that action, and we needed to use the ID delete, or ID of the message, to be able to delete that one. So now let's assume that we've already got our conversation, we redisplayed it, so everything's good there. On page binding, if you do recall, part of that initial part of doing a new conversation is also making sure that everything's going to display correctly. So we're going to go ahead and hide the waiting animation so that it disappears. We're going to go ahead and make sure we are hiding the prompts. We're going to make sure we're showing the messages. Again, sometimes this is going to be redundant work, but it's just making sure that we're able to just reuse the same flow. And then we are going to re-enable the message buttons so that we can then now type in a new message and send that information to OpenAI. And we can reuse it as expected for a brand new conversation. So that is how we will start a new conversation from the text input on this page right here. Now, the other route of this flow, as we said, is if the ID is known, we're going to do continue the conversation instead. So that's its own Xano API call. Little bit different information that we send over. We send over the conversation ID. So since it's not a new conversation, it's an existing one, we need to make sure that we are continuing it and we're giving the entire API the right information it needs to be able to associate all the messages correctly. So we pass in the conversation ID, the current ID that was set by the previous call on the page. We send the new content, which is just our new message that was just entered again. And in this case, we're clarifying the role is the user. If you were to, let's say, want to send a system message into the process, you could add a system message, which wouldn't be, the way we've set it up, system messages are logged, but will never be displayed on the chat side. You could do that as well. We don't have any custom system messages in here, but that would be a way you could run the same call, just do a system message. You wouldn't need to refresh the page or anything as a result, but it would add it as a item in the thread of the conversation history for it all to work appropriately. A way to think about a system message, let's say we're at a table talking to each other. We're across the table chatting back and forth. That's our chat history. But let's say I wanted you to secretly have some information so that you could use that in our conversation history, but it's not said aloud. I could write something on a note, put it face down, and slide it across the table to you. So that's what a system message is. It's just some other information that I can give the other person that doesn't look like it's a part of our chat history. So here's an example where you could use this inside of your own version of a chat bot. Let's say you were using this chat to use as chat for your customers inside of your own SaaS on Bildr. And they asked a question like, hey, can you tell me my next billing date? Well, the AI by default doesn't have any idea what that information is. That's private information. And so what you can do is automatically in a system message, you can send a message along with the user's message. You can send a system message and say, hey, FYI, here's this user and here's their list of billing dates. So now the AI has the information that it needs to be able to discern the billing dates or billing history or whatever, and it can see the actual question that the user asked, and the AI can use a system message, the whole conversation history, as well as the most recent message to know what it is that it wants to respond with. And so that's just one small example, passing relevant data about a problem into the conversation chat history without it being an actual explicit chat is a way to use a system message. And so let's jump over to the AI call for a continue conversation, because again, we just said we passed the conversation ID, the content, and the role. We just did that on the Bildr side. Now on the Xano side, before we send this to OpenAI, now we're going to do all the work to make sure all of the messages are brought together and appropriately displayed. And so we run a query first to get all of the messages that share the conversation ID that was passed here. And then we make sure that they're ordered correctly and add on the brand new message. So basically we're just creating an entire set of data for the whole conversation history to send to OpenAI. Because again, OpenAI doesn't know what you asked it 10 seconds ago. It doesn't know anything except for exactly what it's being presented in every single API call and request that you send in. And so we're doing the work first to group all the information together so that we can go ask it and it can behave as if we are really having a live back and forth conversation. And so we do all of that work right here to assemble all the messages into their correct historical thread. And then we send the OpenAI request. And then we just do the update of the brand, adding the brand new messages to the history of the records in our messages collection. And then ultimately the result we get for a continued conversation is also in the same way, just a confirmation. I'm going to X this out. Did this work? We're going to see the network call for continued conversation. We're going to look at our, there we go. Here we go. So we see the status 200, it was successful, awesome. And so what we look at in Bildr then, when it runs on success, when we get a 200 code, we know we can go ahead and proceed to the next one. Now, if we got a 400 or it failed, we would run these things, but we know it's good. So we go ahead and move to the next step. With the next step, we don't have to worry this time about refreshing the conversations because it was already an existing conversation. So we don't have to go get anything. We didn't create a new conversation. So we just get the conversations with the ID that we already have on the page. And then that's what eventually gets brought in and refreshes, and it runs through the same process. This is the same flow that we use on page load, the same flow we use after we start a new conversation. It's the exact same one. And so that's the process of starting a conversation from chat and getting the history of the conversation back from the chat inside of this template right here. Now let's go over to the other way that we can start a conversation with our prompts row page. Our prompts row page, as we recall, if we jump over here, we hit new conversation, we can see all of the prompts on the page. And they can start a conversation thread directly from it. So let's do no code best practices. You can see the message is the actual description of that prompt that we had. And what we're going to do on the confirmation of the new thread, we will refresh this list and it should use the title of that prompt to name the conversation. So we got the response back. You can see that took a little bit longer. If you send something that's long, or if you request something that you expect a longer set of information back, you can generally expect it to take a little bit longer too. So that's why this reply took a little bit longer to get information back to us. Let's see what was actually occurring on the Bildr side. So we click on this div, that's the entire prompt here. We click And the first thing that we do is remove the interactions from all the prompt pages. So basically we just prevent double clicks by doing this so that you can't like click the same prompt twice really quickly or click two really quickly. It'll still just send one call. We add the prompt selected style class to this. Reality is the way that we're doing this, we now show the prompt message on the page right away. So these get hidden fairly quickly through this flow right here where we show the animation. If you recall, this is the same flow that shows the animation here and then hides this, shows this, and puts the message that we want from the variable newMessage into the page. And so that's why it's still happening in the exact same way, is because we're doing all of this work here and then running it all on this page right here. And then finally, we are running the start new conversation flow on this page as well. So we are reusing the API call on this page by default, because that's what's going to create the experience that we have here, where when we select a new prompt, we immediately show the animation, show the message, and then have the same experience like we're starting a chat from here. I'm using the same process. I'm just triggering it from a different spot and making sure I'm getting all of the right context available to these flows so that they can run as designed. So that takes care of our starting a new conversation, going back and forth with the chatbot, and using our chat pages start to finish. So our prompts page, as you can tell, is reused in two different contexts. But depending on the context, I don't want my prompts here to click and start a conversation. I want them to behave differently, but I don't want to have to design it and manage it in two different spots. And so you'll see that on page load of the prompts row page, one thing I do is I have this if-then logic check that looks for the parent page variable, so a variable on the page that this is on. If the edit prompt variable is equal to yes, set state edit prompt. What that does, it shows this little hidden picture right here. That's an edit icon, and it sets the interaction on the div to do nothing. So basically I've removed that start a conversation interaction, and instead I add a little icon at the top here to click to edit that specific prompt. And so the alternative is on page binding, if then logic, I click to start conversation, and I just make sure the interaction is set to open up the conversation as normal on this page. I don't technically have to have this since I have the default to already do this. So I might have removed that in like polishing design, but either way, the same thing's happening then. Now, let me show you what I mean by this. On new conversation, this is what it looks like. Now, if I go over to our manage prompts page, you can see my edit icon is appearing at the top right here. And so that edit icon is actually going to pull up this page that lets me edit this prompt, brand new edit. So the description now says brand new edit. And so it's reusing the same element. I only have to design and style one time and letting me use it in a couple different spots inside of my application. Now, let me jump to messages before I go into the create and manage prompts area. So if I go down our messages page, I mentioned earlier a few things about our messages page. First of all, on page load, I do a few things to make sure it is the expected feeling of what we're looking at. So first of all, if you recall, let me X this out, click describe this. We did our conversation, get conversation history. In our result, we can see the different messages that we received. And remember, our content in the response that we get the conversation history is the actual message that appears on the screen. So we see create a new code, no code application. And then we also have variables for all of these values, which we use for a variety of things. But in this case, we want to look directly at the role, so variable role, if it's user or assistant. Because if it's a user, I want to show it like as if that was a user's message. But if it's an assistant, I want to show it as if it's an assistant message. So on the page load of our messages row, I run this logic to check the variable role is equal to user. If it's equal to user, I'll set state user message, And if it's not, I know that it's an assistant message. So I go ahead and set state AI chat message. And so the only real difference is when it's a AI chat message, I'm setting the background color a little bit darker to indicate a different message author. I am showing our thumbs up, thumbs downs. So our thumbs up, thumbs downs are right there. Those don't do anything besides just show those messages. Those could be used as a system prompt. Like if I was trying to train it and say, I didn't like or I did like this message, I could maybe run an API call that adds a system message so that the AI knows that the next time and can adjust accordingly. And then I update the profile picture image icon that shows up right here. So this profile picture right here, I'll go ahead and update it with in this case, I just chose the Bildr logo, the BildrB logo. And if it was a user message, I'm just showing the user icon right here instead. And so that's just another example of using a variable from the data that came from this API call. I can see it here. I use this as a variable to determine what this page should actually look like. In addition to that logic on checking what the page should look like and setting the certain state, I've also data bound this element on my row page to the content variable that came in. So the content variable came in, that's the message. And so when the page loads, eventually I'll run the page bindings action, which looks for a home for the variable name content in this case, and sets it directly into our Markdown display element I use right here. One thing that's notable is we're using Markdown display specifically because the way that AI gives responses back is in a format called Markdown, which basically is a way for it to give us headings, to give us clarity on like, hey, like there should be 2 spaces here, or this is a numbered list. If it was just raw straight text, it wouldn't be formatted like we expected. But our Markdown display element unpacks Markdown, this style that the information comes back from AI in, and make sure it gets displayed correctly. And a good example of this, hey, can you give me 2 examples of JavaScript and JSON? This probably will take a little bit, but a really good example for this is asking for custom code blocks. And I do something else here. I talked earlier about, or at the beginning, about how I have in the page headers, I have this library called the Prettify library. This is doing something to look at the code blocks that the Markdown information is giving us from the API call. So in this response, let's go look at the API call response we just got, this most recent message. So you can see this /n/n, and we can see right here, we've got it, there we go. So right here, we're starting to know like this information is a way for the AI to tell this Markdown element, hey, FYI, this is code. One of the things that we do after the page binding runs, I run these 2 actions, which were created by my page header here. So I'm defining this action right here, add pretty print, and then I'm defining this action right here, trigger Prettify. Now, literally ChatGPT and Google wrote all of that for me, and the whole library that this is referring to, this information right here, is also just a pre-written JavaScript library. By including this here, we go get all the code, so it's all available to us and we can use it how we want. And so what I've done is when I load this page, I want to make sure that I'm looking for blocks that look like code, and then I'm making it look the way I want it to. That's what these 2 functions are doing. And so that's why these elements are showing up as code blocks here for me to reuse. And I can even copy this, and it'll actually copy the code for me to be able to use how I want. And so those are a couple of the unique things happening on page load when it comes to how we're getting the data, how we're using the variables from the response, and how we're unpacking it with the Markdown element and some custom, or rather, it's not even custom JavaScript. It's actually just, we just integrated a third-party library that was available on the web, like thousands and thousands are out there. We just integrated a third-party library so that we could do this prettification process instead of just looking at code like every other text element on the page. The other thing I wanted to mention that I do as well on our messages is I like to make sure that when I load a new message, I scroll to the bottom message. So we know we've got messages above this, but I like scrolling to the most recent message by default, which is kind of an experience that we expect for a lot of message histories like text, chats, all that kind of stuff. And so a way to achieve that is we do this if-then logic check. One important note about variables that automatically exist, and we have this in our Bildr 101. If you go through that and you research repeating lists, you'll see this, is we automatically create this variable called _array index. So that variable exists anytime you are on a page that is used for a repeating list. We have this variable right here. And that's the exact location inside of that specific array, or rather the repeating list, which is just an array of data. It's the exact location of that row. And so one way to visualize this is, if we recall, we have 4 chats right here that came back with this request for information: 1, 2, 3, and 4. A really important note is this is the array index. And so every time you have an array, it's going to start with 0. 0 is an item, and it's going to continue from there. And the variable array index on every single row is this value that you see. Bildr does that automatically so that it's very easy for you to locate rows and understand where they are in the actual element, because there's all sorts of things like drag and drop, like checking a box and like moving it up in a list or a row. Like if you're reprioritizing, like, oh, I want this one to be one higher. There's all sorts of reasons that knowing and having that variable is really valuable. And in this case, what I do is I use that array index and I add 1 to it. And I add 1 again because 0 is a number. So 0 is included. So even though this is like the 4th message, its array index value is 3 by default. And so what I would like to do, I want to get the array index and add 1. And if that value is equal to the length of the repeating list, I want to scroll to that specific page at that moment. Now, every repeating list can also just be thought of as a database, just be thought of as a JSON array of objects. Every object represents one page. And so when I do this, I'm basically looking at, okay, I'm going to call out this repeating list element that exists on this page right here. Look at the length of the value of the element. Length is just a way to tell us how long or how many items there are in that list. If I were to do length of, let's say, a string of characters, like in a text box, it would count the number of characters and spit out that number. If I do length from an element like this, or if I had like a JSON array of objects inside of a variable, it would tell me the number of objects that appear. So this is telling me the exact number of objects inside of this. And this is telling me its location inside of it. If that's equal, so if the message is equal to the total number of messages inside the array, I know it's the last one, which tells me I want to scroll to it like this. So that's what that on-page load does for messages, and why we create that scroll to bottom effect. You could also, if you wanted to, let's say, toggle that off. I could have a little toggle next to my chat message here, or in settings somewhere too, if it's a user preference. You could build this out. So like under a user account table, you could say, hey, like, do you want to auto scroll to the most recent message? And they could auto scroll to no. And in the same way that we do that, what we could do is we could first do like if then logic, like does this user want this to happen? And wherever we stored that, whether that's on the current user's preferences, or whether that's like a variable that we got from the original Xano poll, if we're using Xano still for that case, we could check that first. And if it was true, then we could do the logic check here. It's all just preference based. And so that's a deeper dive on messages, but there's a few things going on there. And so it was important to note out what was actually occurring. The only other thing actually we didn't mention was the delete message. So the little trash can icon runs that Xano API call for deleting a message, which just looks for messages / and then the ID of the message. So we're pulling the variable there, and then it's just sending the delete API call. So again, if we just jump over to Xano to show that one, we've got messages delete. So it's just looking for, give me messages / the ID of the message you want me to delete, and I'm going to delete it for you. We can copy a message, we can delete a message, and we can like or dislike. So we can do all sorts of things right there. Actually, that might be a good thing to show, is just how are we doing that message that pops up there. So if you recall, when we click liked message, what we're doing is we are setting a variable on the root page for newMessage. So on the root page is always in Bildr going to be the page that's assigned to the URL. So the highest tier page that you have, it's the page that you in our URL routes have exactly on that URL. And I'm changing the newMessage to liked message. And then on that page, I run the flow newMessage show. So if I go over here, I can show you that newMessage show here. And so what I do is I set the value of this box right here. I set that value to the variable I just sent to it. So I just sent newMessage to the root page. And in this case, because this is the root page, you could also do current page and it would work. But I just, by default, if I ever say root, I typically just always choose root. And so by default here, I'm looking at the root page, looking at the variable of newMessage, and I'm changing my message to that. And then I update my top property. So right now the top property is like minus 100, which puts it above the page and technically out of the view of anybody. But when I set it to 50x, it slides in. And then I run a flow 1 second later, actually 2 seconds later. 2 seconds later, I repeat it only once, so it just occurs one time. I do the newMessage hide action, which restores the top value to minus 100 pixels, which slides the message back out of the view of the screen. And so that's how we're using just one message center. We build the flow one time to work, and basically all we do is we update the variable for newMessage, and then we say go run that flow, and then it works. There's 2 more pages to show, and then our PWA. So there's a few more things left. So we've got our create and manage properties page right here. We already showed earlier what it's like to open that up. We pull in all of the individual users' prompts, so the prompts that they've actually created, not the global prompts right now. We could certainly change that if we wanted, but in this case, we're just pulling that user's own custom prompts into the page. And then we are also doing an add a prompt option. So if they want to create their own new prompt, we're opening up that into this new page. One important thing to look at between the flow that can open up this page, either from a specific existing prompt or from adding a new prompt, is we're passing some information in. So we use the open page into container action. We're choosing the page that we want to open. We're reusing the lightbox on the home page, the same lightbox that the login gets added to. We're using that. And so we're choosing that specific component to open it into. And we're passing specific information into the page. And this is the same way that we get JSON objects from like an API call to set variables into it. Anything I do right here will create a variable on that page whenever it opens. So by default, as soon as this page, if I click this button, this page is going to open up and it's going to have a variable of status, and that status will be, the value of that variable is going to be new. And this is important because the way this page behaves changes what I want to actually do. So on page load, if the state is equal to new, I want to set state, create new prompt. And the only really thing I'm changing here is the value of the button. I want it to say add prompt if I'm creating a new one. And if it's an existing prompt, I want to say edit prompt. So it's a fairly straightforward process there. The one thing actually I need to do, create prompt, edit prompt. This should already be there. I think I messed with this earlier. So you should also see for set state edit existing prompt, you should see page binding run immediately after. Oh, that's actually what the change was. So on page load. Actually, it already did that. So it was either set state create new prompt or it was run page binding if it wasn't a new status. And then in page binding, we run page bindings and we set state existing prompt. So let me go ahead and remove that or else we'll get a little bit of a looping effect. And the reason that we run page bindings is because when we are sending an existing prompt into it, if we look at our open to edit prompt option here, we are doing the same thing, opening the same page into the same container. But in this case, our custom mapping is including a few different values, because when we load this page, we need to show the prompt name. We need to show the prompt description. And ultimately, we need to also show, is this a global prompt or not? Because while we're not showing the global prompts that are owned by the system here, if the user themselves decide to make a prompt global, they can do that. And so we're sending these values from this page into this page so that it can operate appropriately. So that brings me to our user prompts page, where on page load, I want to show you this API call. So we got a must update page load API call. We set that prompt. Then we see our API user prompts only from Xano. Let's pull up the example here, user prompts only. And we can see that this action is just going to return all of the prompts that are owned by the authentication token that we send in. So if user ID of the creator of the prompts is equal to the auth ID, go ahead and send those prompts over. And so this is what this query is, putting them all together, organizing them into an array, and then sending that information back as a response to the API call. So when I run this on this side, let's just clear this out, click manage prompts. We see the user prompts only call get run. And we see the data that came in right here. We have 4 prompts that popped up, and they all have these values right here. And we can see the variables that were set. So we created global prompt ID, prompt description, prompt title, and then the user ID as well. When I open up this page right here, I know if I'm editing this specific prompt, this page needs the context of the prompt's title, the prompt description, the global prompt being true or false, as well as the ID. So if and when I edit this, it can update the correct page. So the way that we achieve that is when we click on this page, we click open to edit prompt, we are sending this information over. So we send the ID, we create a variable called ID from the current ID on our page. We create a variable called title from the current variable prompt title. Don't ask why I'm not using the same words there. Just the way it was set up. But normally I'd probably, if I was cleaning up, I would just name them the exact same things. We get the descriptions right there, and then we get the global prompt information there as well. And so if we slide over to our newer edit prompts page, when it is an existing prompt, we run page binding. And page binding works, remember, is we're setting in anything that has been clarified in the studio as bound to a specific value. In this case, we use variables a lot for external data sources. If we were using a Bildr collection, we would just pull from the data collection field. So we use from variable title name is sent from the previous one. And so page binding will set the title value into our text element. The same thing for description, and then the same thing for our select element here. Global is set into it. One little interesting thing about select elements is select elements will always have 2 things. They'll have a value and a display name. Really frequently, the value is going to be like an ID or something about the record if you're selecting it. And then the display name might be like the name of it. So if I was displaying a list of people, I would have the ID of the person and then maybe display the person's name in the dropdown. So the user just sees their name, but the actual value is their ID. And that's really common that you'll use with Bildr data collections. This is how you'll do it. If you bound it from a data collection, you would update it with specific settings here. However, in this case, I know that the global prompt is going to come as a true or a false from Xano. The global prompt is a Boolean variable. Boolean just means yes or no, 1 or 0, true or false. In Xano's case, they always send a true or false for that. So in this case, I've built in options to say, if it's false, equal to no, if it's true, equal to yes. Whenever it does the data binding, it's going to display yes or no, depending on what that actual prompt is. So if I edited this prompt to global, and I hit edit, now if I load this up, that will already default to yes because it is a global prompt at that point. I'm going to edit it back to no. And so that's the data binding, setting the information into the page. The final point of this is that when I click create or edit prompt, I run the Xano API call, create or edit prompt. That is basically looking for what are the values that you want to update. So we're updating the title, the description, the global prompt status, as well as the ID. So we'll go to the Xano call, create or edit prompt. You can see these are the values that we just talked about, and these are the ones that we're mapping the new values in. And we're just tying those values to the elements that they're coming from. So if I change something in the title, I'm just grabbing the value from the title and I'm sending it in. Same for description, and the same for the global prompt right here in the select element. One little interesting part here is that we also have prompt ID here. And if you recall, if we're creating a new prompt, it's not going to have an ID yet because there was no ID for it to exist. So the Xano call knows if the ID is here, we are actually going to be just updating this information for the prompt whose ID I already know. If there is no ID that comes in, instead of updating it, I'm just going to create a new prompt and send it into the database. Once we get the responses back, we want to close this box. So we do two things. One, we run a flow on our home page again that has a hide light box. So we're just hiding the menu, hiding this from the screen. And two, we run a flow on our create and manage prompts play to page load again. The reason that is because on page load, we go back to Xano and say, hey, we want to display our user prompts and we want to go get it so it's up to date. And so this is going to go get all of the prompts again so that we can put them on our screen and make sure that we have a fresh set of prompts. So if we added one, we can see that right away. Or if we changed it, we can also see that. Let's add a new prompt. Okay. So you can see I added a new prompt. It exists right here, and it instantly in our in our history here, we can see we did create or edit prompt. So that created this. It gives us the confirmation back saying, okay, great. You created this prompt. Here's that prompt. And then we instantly go back to our manage prompts page and request for a new update so that we get all of the up-to-date information. You could get creative and actually just pass the new information from this API call into this, the same way that our messages get merged. You could just merge the updated prompt into the page, or if it was an updated prompt, like an edit of an existing one, you could run a flow specifically on this page to just do the updates, which would basically save you one API call. You could do the updates locally through a set of flows and then do one API call, and the same experience would be created for your current user on the page, and you would just do one less API call too. So that's one way to get creative as you're optimizing. So that is how the app that you have here works in its entirety. From the home screen, you're having conversations back and forth, using Xano as the backend, using prompts and pages throughout the process so that you can reuse elements and you can reuse pages inside of each other. The final thing to go over is that this out of the box is already a PWA for you. A PWA is a progressive web app, and it lets you install that particular app to a phone. It's not installed directly through an app store. It's directly installed from your browser to that person's phone, along with this individual template and along with you being able to set up any of your Bildr projects as a progressive web app. We've also created some logic of a flow that will run when you load the app. If the browser recognizes this is on a device that I could install this application to, it will send a notification to the user to say, hey, you might want to install this. And so the specific flow that gets run, if that is true, is check for OpenAPI prompt for PWA install. So the first thing that we do is we get a cookie called prompted last 30. This is how I set it up because we don't want to prompt the users every single time the page loads. That gets a little bit excessive. However, every 30 days is less excessive. So I set a cookie called prompted last 30 to yes. If that value, so in this case now I'm getting the cookie, and then I check the value. If it's equal to yes, actually, I think this is opposite of what I intended to do. Let's look. Yeah, so I'm just doing the opposite here for you. So we might need to switch that. I'll double check it on the template to make sure you're good. But if it's equal to yes, what I would really want to do is do nothing. And if it's not, I want to do open prompt for PWA install. And there we go. So I open the prompt on the page, which basically is going to open up our PWA prompt, which takes over the screen and says, hey, do you want to install the app? And our prompts even are recognizing the type of browser that it's on. This page in general, you probably will only ever need to edit this content so that you just update it for whatever you want to say here. But there's a series of flows basically looking for the type of device that it's on. So it gives the end user the correct instructions to install the application on their page. So that is the complete walkthrough of the Bildr Xano application, the chatbot here. You're going to be able to install this as your own project, open up a brand new project from it. You'll also be able to bring this in as a pattern to your project if you want to, so that you can just add this to your existing system instead of starting a new project from it too. Whatever your preference is, you're going to be able to do it. So if you have any questions, I'd love to know in the comments, would love to know in the Discord, or just let us know what you want to build with it, what you're going to do, and show us as you make progress. We'd love to see it.